So I'm Troy Tacey. I'm from Fordham University, and I'm going to do my best to take you on a whirlwind tour of infectious disease in the tenements over about a century and 15 minutes. So wish me good luck, okay? So this is joint work with a friend and colleague of mine, Jason Barr, and we also had some data collection help from another friend, Wei Yu. So I'm going to start a bit before my period of study. And this is a map of the deaths in New York City of the 1832 cholera outbreak, when cholera first arrived in North America. And what you can see pretty clearly is that there's a big concentration right in the middle of that map, and there's very few other deaths in other areas. So if you know a little bit about New York City, that's the 5 Points neighborhood. So if you think about the Scorsese movie Gangs of New York, that's where all those deaths are happening on the map that I just showed you. Now, to understand a little bit what's happening, you have to understand a little bit of the history of 5 Points and where it came from. So where 5 Points was located used to be this area called Collect Pond. It was this really beautiful, bucolic pond, freshwater, fed by an underground spring that was sort of a place that the affluent folks of New York would go to have a picnic. Fresh water was good. They didn't have a lot of it in New York City. Breweries, tanneries, factories, etc. show up. They do what they do. They throw all their waste into the pond. It becomes horribly polluted. The city decides that they need to drain it. So they build a canal, which is today Canal Street. They plow in this big hill that used to sit next to Collect Pond, and they create new land where Collect Pond used to be. So, of course, New York City developers and builders aren't much different today than they were back then. They want to make a buck, right? So they build this new sort of high-end residential area, and they name it Paradise Square. Of course, they built this over a pond in a marsh, fed by an underground spring. It sinks. So everybody moves out that has any money. Developers, they don't want to lose money, so they take all of these factories and warehouses and larger apartments and things, and they divide it up into these tiny little spaces that, you know, kind of look like this room if you divide it into 4 or something, or sometimes maybe even 8. And that's where a bunch of immigrants start flooding in and living there. Okay? So again, it's marshy, it's wet, streets are muddy, basements are wet. It's a perfect place for cholera to spread when it arrives. So that's, you know, kind of where 5 Points comes from. So if you think about 5 Points, what I'm going to be talking about today are tenements. And these are really, in some sense, some of the first tenements in New York City. And they're very, you know, unplanned, ramshackle sort of dwellings for people. Now, along with this, of course, is a view that the tenements and particularly the people that live within them are to blame for what's going on. So you have a quote here from John Pintard, who was the co-founder of the New York Historical Society and also the Secretary of Commerce for New York City at one point. He was writing letters to his daughter, who fled New York City to New Jersey when cholera arrived. And he writes, at present, cholera is almost exclusively confined to the lower classes of intemperate, dissolute, and filthy people huddled together like swine in their polluted habitations. And it gets better, right? He next says, those sickened must be cured or die off, being chiefly of the very scum of the city. The quicker they're dispatched, the sooner the malady will cease. So there's not a lot of sympathy for the folks living in the tenements, and they're very much being blamed for everything that's going on. Now, if we fast forward a little bit to later in the century, in many ways, the you know, opinions haven't changed that much. So even Jacob Riis, who was working as a reformer, writes in the introduction to How the Other Half Lives, in the tenements all the influences make for evil because they are the hotbeds of the epidemics that carry death to the rich and poor alike. So again, we've got folks in the tenements being blamed for the epidemics, as opposed to recognizing that it's the conditions in which they live that are causing the infectious diseases to spread and to breed. Excuse me. So just to give you a sense of, we've got 5 Points, very ramshackle tenements. Next generation that Riis writes a lot about is this, an example of would be Gotham Court. And Gotham Court was this 5-story building. You can see on the right some pictures of some children playing in an alley next to the tenement. And here's the layout of the building. You can see that there wasn't, there aren't any windows, there aren't doors exterior. You just have people entering through these staircases, going to these small little rooms, well, 2 rooms actually, but in total they were about 225 square feet. So something about probably 2/3 of whatever the rooms are upstairs here is where these families were living. Again, you see no kitchens. You see these little rectangles or squares here. Those are essentially outhouses that were down in the basement that had to be emptied. And these were air vents that allowed essentially the stench to leave the basement into the alleys. So New Yorkers recognized there's bad stuff going on here. They implement a series of tenement acts to try to make things better. And I don't have time to go through them all in detail, but essentially they're implementing more strict, allowing for some sanitation and requirements to get more ventilation within the buildings. And again, it's sort of a series of reforms. The first one, actually the second one, you get these dumbbell-shaped buildings that you can kind of see why they're called dumbbells with on the left, those are the white spaces are air shafts that go down between the buildings. And then you can see a picture from above of one of the air shafts. And it likely helped, right? It gave some ventilation, but it wasn't an amazing improvement, most likely. Later, we get the new law tenements in New York City, and they require more ventilation. They require courtyards. They require windows that open to the streets or to a backyard if it's of sufficient size. You can also see in the diagram on the bottom, you see the bathrooms and toilets and stuff. So they required a toilet in every apartment. So what are we going to do? First thing that Jason and I wanted to know was, were the tenements really more dangerous than other parts of the city? If so, by how much? And then we wanted to know, try to see if we could figure out a little bit about whether or not the Tenement Acts actually did some good within the tenements. So again, 15 minutes, I don't have a lot of time to talk about all of our data, but for part of it, we're relying on an economic history project by Dora Costa and Robert Fogel that cobbles together a whole bunch of different resources from New York City vital statistics and census, New York City tenement reports, a whole bunch of different stuff they collected and then digitized. And then what Jason and I add to this is we scrape through a bunch of stuff that's on the web to come up with a listing of all the building permits in New York City from 1868 to present day, and we're going to go up through 1910 for the study we're looking at here. So what we're first going to do is just try to figure out which areas of the city had more infectious disease mortality than others, and then second, if there's differences across the city, what might have I was going to say the word cause, and this certainly isn't a causal study, but what perhaps could have contributed to it. I'll say that. So here's what we get. So at the time, late 19th and early 20th century, New York City was divided up into 22 wards. They're kind of haphazardly labeled, but you can see all of the different wards on the map up above. Now, the dark blue areas are areas that were more safe than average by about 1/4 to 0.5%, and the red areas are more dangerous. And if you know about New York City, part of this picture makes sense and part of it doesn't. The part that makes sense is this area right here. That's where 5 Points was in the 6th ward, right? So that's sort of old tenements and the southwest corner of the southern tip of Manhattan. What was somewhat surprising to us, though, is this is the area that we call the Lower East Side, right? It's where the Tenement Museum is. It's the, when Reese writes about it, he calls it the most dense place on earth, right? So, but it turns out it was more safe than most of the rest of the city. And we'll talk about why that is now. So if you take our building information about where they were building new buildings, they were building like crazy in the Lower East Side to house all the flood of immigrants that were arriving in New York City in the late 19th and early 20th century. And what we find is that if you increase new buildings in this area by 10%, that lowered infectious disease mortality by about 1%. And this is controlling for density and the presence of new immigrants and wealth and environmental factors and a whole bunch of stuff. The second thing that we find is that things like density, wealth, presence of new immigrants, they don't tend to they don't have an effect on this infectious disease mortality. And I think this is somewhat interesting. I have a new book that came out this spring where I talk about sort of the nuances of density. And we tend to think about density as, people per square mile or per acre. But what really matters with density is how people interact in small spaces. What we're going to see in a moment is that, these new buildings, they were safer, right? They kept people apart better. They gave them more ventilation. They gave them sanitation. And people were just more safe. And other areas of the city that had the older tenements, they just didn't, they were stuck with 1832 cholera and the same problems that they had at the beginning of the century. And sort of give you some visuals of this. So these are all the new tenements that were permitted in the 1870s. And you can see over Lower Manhattan, they're kind of evenly dispersed. But as we march through in time, you're going to notice that they really concentrated in the Lower East Side. And the areas that were more risky have far fewer new tenements going in than the places that end up being more safe. And again, you can see that in the 1900s. And then by the 1910s, for the most part, the tenement building boom was over. There's another building boom in the 1920s, but we ended our study here when kind of the traditional tenements were done. So we can think about a few other sort of things to convince you, because we're not we don't have a lot of power in our professions, so we kind of want to have a better understanding of exactly what's going on here. So if you look at just the amount of building per population, so if we fix our population as of 1880, the more risky wards, again, think about 5 points, added about 93 square feet per person. The safer wards added about 257. So they built something per person about the size of one of those Gotham Square tenements. And then if you would like to look at the flow of people moving into the neighborhoods or the wards, they build about 469 square feet per new immigrant that moved in, or new person that moved in to these various areas. And that's about twice the size of one of those Gotham Court buildings again. The other thing that we find, and 2 minutes, 3 minutes? 3 minutes. 2 minutes, okay, perfect. Is that another measure you can think about, if we're building new buildings, we can also think about what was left behind. And if you look at the areas that had more infectious disease mortality during this time, there was a much larger presence of what were called rear tenements. And rear tenements are just like what they sound. They're kind of a haphazard building that was tacked onto the backside of a traditional tenement, and you see a couple examples here. And note that both of these buildings are 3 stories tall, so you're housing most likely a lot of people in something that looks like this, which certainly doesn't look like a very safe place to be. So the 6th ward and the 14th ward, so again, 6th ward is 5 points, 14th ward is just above it, had almost a quarter of its tenement housing stock in these rear tenements. Whereas the safer wards had, the highest one was 12%, that was the 10th ward, which is adjacent to those 2 wards, and then all the other wards were much, much lower than that as far as rear tenements. Now, Jason, I think there's kind of an interesting story here that goes against things like what Pintard and Reese were saying, and most of the other folks in New York. We're finding that areas that have more tenements built are actually safer. And you can think about the fact that if we didn't have huge floods of immigrants coming to the city, we wouldn't have built all these new buildings. So in many ways, having all of these immigrants coming into New York made New York safer for the immigrants, and it also made it safer for everybody, right? So in many ways, blaming immigration for what was going on in New York was just wrong. And then to wrap up, there's kind of a neat quote. So this isn't during our period of study, but I think it kind of encapsulates our findings. So this is from the State Board of Housing to Franklin Roosevelt, who was the governor of New York at the time. And the report says, since the beginning of 1920, nearly 87,000 of the poorest old lot tenements have been vacated, and fortunately about 39,000 of these have been demolished, that at no time in the future will they become a menace to public health and decent housing standards, right? So again, this kind of goes right along with our story that we were getting rid of this old, unsafe housing, in many cases destroying it, and replacing it with buildings that were more safe, at least in certain areas of the city. Okay. Thank you.